Welcome to the What If podcast, where we discuss all things development, citizen engagement, democracy, and sustainable development as well. Today, I am joined by Dr. Tendai Murisa, who is Tendai. I got it the other time. I'll call him Tendai. My name is Nontsikelelo Nzula. Today, we are discussing Zimbabwe's land and agrarian reform. Tendai, how are you today?
I'm good, thanks, and thanks for having me.
Are you ready for this discussion?
Yeah, come with it some form of trepidation, given the challenges and the tensions around land reform. Yeah.
Absolutely. So I'm going to start with a very basic question. Yeah. It's 24 years now after the beginning of the Fast Track Land Reform Program, which started in the year 2000, in case people have a hard time calculating. So can you just walk us through what happened?
Yeah. My mentor, Professor Samuel, who's going to be with the Lord, may his soul rest in peace, could be shaking in his grave, troubled by where we are. Because I think, to start off with, Zimbabwe's land reform from three angles. Social justice, it was necessary. Historical restoration, it was necessary. Democracy, it was necessary to have land reform. And was it necessary to do it aggressively the way we did fast track land reform, etc., given the nature of the fast track part? Maybe, but in hindsight, I think we moved too fast and we did not make proper adjustments. So 24 years later, like you're asking, since 2000, we're at crossroads again. It's a moment, I think, for policymakers to finalize a number of things. And I think what is outstanding, and that is an albatross around the land reform process itself, what is constraining or limiting progress, is the land tenure itself. What has happened is we took farms that were on what we call freehold tenure, and we converted that tenure to what you may call permissory tenure and leasehold tenure. But that actually has not been implemented to the full. So the majority of the people who were given land are holding it on the basis of an offer letter from the Minister of Lands. So the issues to do, because land reform has got many categories and many aspects. There's the redistribution aspect. I think that is complete. Redistribution. There could be an issue around multiple farm ownership, where you have to make sure that the policy was always one man, one farm, or one woman, one family, one farm. So that there are challenges, especially to do with the elites, politically connected elites that have been seen to have multiple farms. So that part is more or less done. We know what needs to be done. But the challenge, so that's the redistribution part, but the challenge is around the manner in which you hold land, which we call land tenure. That has not been resolved.
All right, can I just go back to the definitions that you gave around the two options that are available? Could you just shed a little more light on that?
Okay, so in options, you mean the different ways of holding land?
Yes.
So when we carried out the land reform program, remember fast track, by its very nature, followed organic land occupations. There were people who were occupying farms, and government was coming in to really sort of sanitize the occupations and begin to offer land, introduce a basic planning framework. So some farms were divided into what we call A1 farms. These are the smaller farms for smallholder agriculture. In many instances, they are 6 hectares, and then you have your 6 hectares as a family, but also as a group, you also have access to grazing land. So it really mimics what you have in the customary tenure areas. So that's one aspect. And in those areas, they were given what we call permits. And these have a 99-year framework, the 99-year permits. And those permits are in the names of families. So that's the most progressive part. While it's customary tenure, the challenge we have had for some of us who fight from a feminist lens around rights, etc., was the fact that women were struggling to access land. But in fast track, we actually begin to see that government was encouraging joint ownership or joint registration. So that's the permits in A1 areas. Then A2, they were designed for commercial agriculture. So they range in farm sizes according to natural regions. You know, Zimbabwe is divided into 5 natural regions. So you find that smaller land sizes are in natural region 1 and 2 because that land is considered fertile, high patterns of rain, etc. So you can be engaged in horticulture, etc., etc. But as you go to natural regions 4 and 5, where you are now doing livestock, the plots get to be bigger. So there's actually a study that was done by Chris Uume and Sam Moyo that talked about recommended farm sizes in Zimbabwe. It's an interesting and it's an important study. People in A2 areas got what we call 99-year leases. Again, it followed the same pattern. These leases were registered jointly in the event that we're talking of married couples. And our studies show that some women actually got land in their own right. So that's sort of the framework around the redistribution.
So I guess we made a little bit of progress there around empowering women. Forgive me, Doc, for mentioning.
Sure. Mm-hmm.
All right, so having spoken about the fast track aspect that maybe we could have gotten wrong, how has that changed the dynamic of land ownership, and how has it influenced agricultural practices and productivity in Zimbabwe?
That's the big question, because I think 24 years later, emotions have sort of sobered up. We're in a place where we're beginning to reflect. And one thing that we're realizing that in the absence of resolving the land tenure related challenges, so this tenure shortcut that people use in financial services, they say the existing tenure systems are not bankable. So that means you cannot take your offer letter to go to the bank and secure a loan, for production. That is the real challenge. So in many instances, what we are finding on the farms, there are two patterns of financing production. Either you're getting support from government through maybe modern day what we call command agriculture, the supply of inputs, infrastructure, etc., for you to farm. Then others are self-financing. But if you look prior to land reform, one of the things that made Zimbabwe different from many other African countries was its sophisticated financing mechanism for agriculture, the financing ecosystem. So we had local banks, we had government, and also had international banks financing us. So the backdrop of 2000 is the 1990s decade. That was the era of economic liberalization. I'm not so sure how old you were, but this was the time of economic structure adjustment programs. But in it, the biggest beneficiaries of ESAP were commercial farmers, because at that moment, we began to access new markets in terms of agricultural products, horticulture products. So we found ourselves beginning to export flowers, beginning to farm things like ostrich farming, and beginning to establish even game parks. So there was a lot of changes to land utilization, because there was this dividend that there was peace in Zimbabwe and there were new demands on what we could produce. But something happened then. We began to secure financing from outside. So government would issue what they called a certificate of no present interest on the farm, to say this farm, we have no interest in it. You can actually continue to you can continue to borrow money on the basis of the title that you have. So farmers would borrow locally and they'll borrow internationally. But it created a challenge when we now started fast track, because we now had what we call beeper farms. These beeper farms are just generally, these are on bilateral partnerships. So what it means is somebody would have gone, a dairy farmer would have gone to Germany, to the Netherlands, secured a big loan to modernize their farm. By modernizing their farm, they're getting all the equipment that is maybe current in Europe at that moment, but on the basis that they will have capacity to repay the loan. So 3-4 years later into servicing that loan, which is probably a 25-year loan, boom, fast track happens. And because of the chaotic manner in which I described, that government was coming to sanitize occupations that had happened. For most of the people that were occupying farms, they did not know that this is a beeper farm. This is not a beeper farm. So they just occupied farms.
But people care?
Yeah, people did not understand what was at stake. And even some elites went for those farms that had very sophisticated infrastructure. So farms that had greenhouses, etc., they occupied those. By the time, I think by 2003, 2004, the then president, when he began to realize the danger where he had set the country to, he began to say, no, there should be no occupation of tea estates, there should be no occupation of timber estates, etc., because these were on paper agreements and many other farms. But damage had already been done. So you would know that presently, the government of Zimbabwe has lost a case against Border Timbers. Yeah. Border Timbers was also on a beeper agreement, their farm was taken away. So they've sued the government of Zimbabwe. And there are many cases like that where the government of Zimbabwe was lost because these farms were beeper farms. And I hasten to say, and this is where perhaps my analysis is always unpopular, to begin to say the crisis of isolation, of Zimbabwe's isolation, is partly caused by land reform. Because at that particular moment when we do land reform, we row against the tide of property rights. Because the framework of accumulation, or the framework of development, capitalism, he has made property rights to be the most important thing for any investor, any would-be investor. When you're considering a destination for your investment, you're worried about the security of the property that you're buying. But Zimbabwe, within a stroke of a pen, cancelled land rights as they existed. Or the freehold land tenure was cancelled for the majority of farms that were taken. So since then, Zimbabwe is yet to recover. Zimbabwe is yet to get the confidence of the international system. So that's the fact 24 years on.
Okay, you've mentioned some of the challenges that are still overlapping from 24 years ago.
Yeah.
Would you like to maybe just break them down a little more as to how exactly is this affecting us now? What does it mean for us?
A good question. So I think at an immediate level, agriculture, by its very nature, especially large-scale agriculture, is normally financed by banks. Yeah, the banks in Zimbabwe do not have the capacity to finance agriculture to the level where it's required. So we are finding ourselves having to depend on a government that is doing what you may call quasi-fiscal activities through the central bank during Gideon Gono's time and even later on, financing agriculture. And that has created a huge deficit on the national fiscus because government is having to finance. And even then, its financing model is not efficient. So it fails to collect on loans it would have given. Half the time loans are cancelled. We have no audit of who received tractors. The late Alex Magaisa wrote about the tractor scandal, that many elites within ZANU-PF and those connected to ZANU-PF had received tractors, but they're not paid for them. So it's been one scandal after the other, and we have not been able to recover. So it has caused a crisis for our government in the fact that the more money it pumps towards agriculture, we're not seeing the dividend. We may hear about the growth in terms of production of wheat, etc., but those are isolated pockets. Like now we're getting into a drought. Many people thought we had a surplus, but it turns out we don't have it. So that's number one. Then number two, if our government is the only one that is financing agriculture, that means it's actually doing it at a cost to other sectors. So there's always a tension, a trade-off. So the more money that is pumped into agriculture, social service is suffering. I'm sure you have seen commentaries about how public hospitals do not have medicines, etc. But this government is a government that is collecting revenue. Where is the money going to? So you look at how much money is going into agriculture for production. So because we have not fixed the land tenure question so that we can bring in private sector players to finance agriculture. So as long as it's government's burden, we have this challenge of inefficient financing models. Governments are not usually good financing a capitalist sector. So they're inefficient in the way they do it or in the way they collect the monies. So that's the real challenge. And production in the process has also collapsed. So we're actually beginning to see that there are certain farmers that have done well, and those are the ones that are producing and pushing things like maize production, tobacco, we've made huge recoveries, soybeans and others. But it has come also at a cost. There are others that are not production. So if you visit, if you do field work, you actually begin to see that some farms in terms of production are shrinking. They're no longer. So we need to do a new land utilization study to see the extent to which farmers are using. Because what is normally a healthy balance is usage of at least 65% of the farm. But I suspect now, given the anecdotal sort of field work we've done, field utilization is less than 30%.
Is that an issue just about funding, or is it also an issue around knowledge?
Yeah, this knowledge question has come up, but when you look at even the study that we carried out way back in 2009 and even now, when you look at the people on the farms now, and this may sound a bit judgmental, they are much more educated than the former large-scale commercial farmers in terms of formal education. These are people who are degree holders, and these are not necessarily agricultural degrees, but they have degrees from various disciplines. Some of them are retirees from senior positions in the civil service, in the private sector, etc. So in terms of education and then adaptation of those skills from another field into agriculture, I don't think that's where we have a problem. I think the real problem has to do with adequate financing. Because like I said, let's just use figures. To plant a hectare of, say, an apple orchard, you need at least 13,000. And this thing is going to give you money after 3 or 4 years. Same with avocado, same with... So in the absence of a very robust financing framework, we actually begin to see people not being able to move in those directions. So for instance, you have seen the return of blueberries, not the return, but actually this is a new crop, etc. And Zimbabwe is really doing well on the international market. But it's also based on a very sophisticated financing infrastructure, which is outside of banks. We don't exactly know where the money is coming from, but we also know that it's mostly, there's only 1 or 2 black large-scale commercial farmers who are into blueberries. The rest are Caucasians who actually got back to the land or their farms were not taken, etc. So that tells you that whenever you're talking about high-valued crops, you actually have to make a huge investment around it, which is where we do not have. So many people are going into things like cabbages, chickens, etc., because they have a quicker turnaround. But the profitability is very limited because the risk is low. So we are yet to see people making long-term investments on their farms. And also, 24 years, as you're saying, people who got land, some of them have gone to be with the Lord, and their children are not interested in farming. So they actually, in the absence of a secure form of tenure, the inheritance processes are also weak. Some people are not willing to invest their money in the absence of a proper title. So it's just not about banks not giving them money, but it's also somebody who's equally capable, but saying, but I just got an offer letter. Because if you read the offer letter, it's a very dangerous document, because the Minister of Lands can withdraw the offer within 24 hours and does not need to explain himself. Can withdraw the offer. So the manner in which land is being held right now is highly insecure and does not promote long-term investment.
So is that the reason why people are reluctant to fully invest in their land?
Partly yes, but in terms of practice, and to be fair, in terms of practice, we have not seen high levels of evictions, except there are special cases. A friend of mine in Matebele and Sipo and his colleagues were evicted from a farm. But I can say this because there are few cases. So in the majority of cases, evictions are few, etc., etc. But it's just that if you have money that you have worked hard for, you're going to consider to say, do I invest in a place where there's no tenure, or do I invest it in an urban property where there's tenure, where I can trade? Because at the moment, the farms are not tradable assets. You cannot trade. So if, say, you, by some reason, you have to migrate or you die and you have no children, etc.
There's no security.
There's no security to say, I can sell the farm to somebody else, because the framework for that is not yet in place.
So we've discussed the issues. We've discussed the long-term, let me call them side effects of the things that we have gone through as a country. So how do we fix it?
Yeah, so I think the first thing, like I said, is let's fix land tenure. The global compensation agreement that government came up with, I think 3-4 years ago, I was one of the few people, and I was unpopular because I gave it a thumbs up. I said it needs to be done from 2 perspectives. A humanitarian perspective, most of the large-scale commercial farmers who lost their land are now pensioners. Some of them do not have savings, so it would be good to compensate them for the improvements on their farms. So I thought that was a good move to make, etc. It creates some flexibility, some room for reconciliation in a country characterized by tension and polarization. That's number 1. But number 2, the tensions that I've mentioned around land tenure can only be resolved if all the people who had their farms taken no longer have any claims on the land. So as you are compensating, they are surrendering their paper title deeds, because they are still holding their paper title deeds, so that you can actually begin to demarcate and do a new system. Because at the moment, most of that land is contested, number 1, at the SADC Tribunal, in courts in Belgium, courts at the European Union, courts in the UK. So most of that land is under contestation. So it's difficult for government, and government maybe has not come out clean to tell people that they cannot move from offer letter to actually begin to issue permits and leases, because they are dealing with the contested assets. Yeah? So that's number 2. But number 3, it's important if you are going to try to lure foreign direct investment, like I've said, the issue of property rights and how it's treated as an important measure to say, is Zimbabwe open for business? Is Zimbabwe ready to do business with the rest of the world? So people are trying to come and invest, say, in an estate, etc., in agro-business. They want to make sure that, because it's not an investment that you make in 1 year and you reap a return in 1 year. So these are long-term investments. So the most important thing is security of tenure. So all those things hinge upon the global compensation agreement. But from what I've seen, there's been no progress. It's no longer part of a big agenda. It's not on the priority list at the moment. No one is talking about it anymore. It means that we have stalled again. We're in a place of stagnation.
Isn't that because people are afraid? It's a very controversial and big issue, and there's issues of race, of which I won't trap you into and discuss those. But could it be a possibility that government is not delving into the issue because it's going to take a lot to fix it? So rather we continue and work with what we have.
But we're not going anywhere. That is a real challenge. We're dancing on the same spot. I thought the Global Compensation Agreement was a bold move by government to help us move forward, because it's a very important, it's a chapter that has to be closed for us to begin to realize the benefits of land reform. Because the idea behind land reform is a noble one. You are trying to broaden participation in the economy. So where you had 5,000 large-scale commercial farms, you've created over 100,000 commercial farms. So even if when you look at the value chains that are doing well, like tobacco, the number of participants have grown. So you begin to see that in many other value chains, the hold up right now is finance. So if you release finances, patient capital towards this thing, I'm sure it can turn around. So I think I totally agree that it's a very sensitive issue, but I found that when we saw government launch the Global Compensation Agreement, it had support from many quarters. The diplomatic community, the large-scale commercial farmers, they were in support of it, and even some farmers groups from the Zimbabwean Africans, they really supported it. Mm-hmm. So the challenge, I suppose, is actually having the money, because I think the assumption of government was that they'll be able to attract international support for it. But I've got an idea for it.
Do you want to share that idea with us?
Yes. My idea has always been to say, yes, there is, in land reform, what you have done is you've redistributed land based on a colonial injustice. But this colonial injustice happened maybe in 1890, 1888 with the Lippert concession, etc. But the world has changed, so you can't just start dishing out land for free. Mm-hmm. So my idea is actually say, why don't you tax the people that have got the farms? So if you begin to tax all the people that have received farms, you tax them according to the farm size that they have. So if they're in natural region 1 and 2, you know that the farms can be efficient and effective at a certain level of acreage. Anything above that, you charge a higher tax. Then you do that for all the farmers who received land. When you implement that tax, and you can actually approach any financial institution after a year of implementing the tax to say, we've actually understood that in a year we can collect so much money. Can you give us an instrument to advance those people who are part of the Global Compensation Agreement, so that we can go ahead with the leases, with the land, the titles. But in the process, what you are doing, your leases now, because how can you say you have leasehold tenure and you're not charging leases?
Right.
So that tax is now a lease, yeah? So farmers are now told that when you get to year 10, you get a certain kind of different lease that says that you can now even begin to trade this asset, you can sell it. So I think government needs to come up with a land bank that can organize this. This cannot be done at ministry level, they are inefficient. We need actually a private sector or a hybrid institution that can do this. All the land is invested in this bank, then we begin to issue this. So the money is just not collected for compensating those who lost land, etc. But it's actually used to develop those areas. Because if you travel in former large-scale commercial farming areas, which we now call fast-track farms, the infrastructure, roads are bad, etc. So you come up with a levy, you develop that. But the challenge is the people who are asking to implement this are also landowners. So you are introducing that's the political economy. That's the challenge around it, to say, do you think people in cabinet who are beneficiaries of this policy can actually begin to say, let's sign into law that we'll all now pay tax? So that's the contest. So there's always a trade-off to policy. When you actually do the political economy of ownership of land, you begin to realize that some things are challenged because of personal interest.
Absolutely, and political interests.
Yeah.
So at CVO, we talk a lot about inclusion. And I'm hearing this idea, and in the back of my head, I'm thinking about the people who got the land, inherited it. They haven't been able to work the land, and now they're being asked to pay taxes. What are we saying about them?
They are sitting on a major asset. And if you see, there's this, again, the confusion that we have in development studies. When we talk about agriculture in Africa, we romanticize the past. You know, it's belonging, etc. It's good. But our agriculture is inserted thoroughly into a capitalist mode, where it has to be about production, investments, and profits. So in the absence of that, land becomes a dead asset. So you've taken something that was highly productive and you're killing it. But you still want to contribute to economic development. Yeah. So those are the tensions we have to deal with as a country. We have to come to a place of maturity to begin to say, okay, we can begin to say there is a land tax. So you can begin to say, I'm sitting on 80 hectares. Maybe my size is actually 30 hectares. So I surrender the other 50 hectares, then I have 30 hectares. And by virtue of surrendering, I get certain tax credits.
Right.
So there's a way of doing it, but we can't abandon it because we really need to find ways of financing the compensation agreement itself and also of financing infrastructure development on those farms.
Absolutely. I think that was well said. And I do think, again, we should have a sequel to discuss your idea. I think it's a brilliant one. I think also just looking at the other side of the coin and how you think this would play out, how long would it take, and what are the possible barriers that we could face in putting this to play, right?
Sure. Unfortunately, land, if there's any commodity that has been subjected to politics unfairly, has been land in Zimbabwe. Since the liberation struggle, land has been at the center of this. So land has always been part of a political discourse. And at times, we don't look at it from an economic discourse. So when you are putting a productive asset like land and you're making it political fodder, we risk actually undermining economic development goals. So I think we need to sober up as a country and begin to look at, say, where are we going? What are our targets? What could we do better with this land? Because Zimbabwe is uniquely endowed in terms of its land asset and in terms of its climate to produce certain niche crops. But we're failing to do that because of the challenges I've mentioned.
Right. There's so much that I want to ask, but I will hold back because we need to end this podcast, unfortunately. So I'll ask you about your closing remarks. What is it that you would like to say around this issue as we conclude?
Yeah, my appeal is to office holders, policymakers, to really spend more time. We've made recommendations as a think tank, and we're not the only ones. There are many, including the World Bank and many other institutions. We actually need a land conference, I believe. It's high time we had a proper land conference, and we agreed on a pathway out of this. Because whether we like it or not, throwing around figures to say, oh, this year we've done so much wheat, we've done this. We are doing it by ignoring the big questions. There are big questions that we're not dealing with. And the biggest question in the room is land tenure and agricultural financing. And we cannot be satisfied with a government-led financing model, because at some point it's costing us in other sectors. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much, Tendai. That was a very interesting discussion around land. And just to mention, he's written a paper around land reform in the journal, African Journal of Inclusive Societies, in our second volume. Am I correct?
Yes, but I think the most important piece will be a very small policy brief on to compensate or not to compensate, where we discuss the global compensation agreement. Very unpopular in some populist quarters, but I think in terms of sober policy work, it's very important for us to engage with the challenges we have on the ground so that we can move forward as a country.
All right, I love that. Let's sober up. And just so that we get to engage with you, can you just tell us what your comments are around the discussion that we've had? So you can comment below, what do you think? And what do you think about the brilliant idea that Tendai had around what we can do to fix our country? So don't forget to follow, to subscribe, and we'll see you in the next episode. It's goodbye for now.
Thank you so much for taking time to listen. Please feel free to rate and review us on iTunes. But if you have any comments or questions, please send them to my email, tendai.murisa@gmail.com, or hit us up on Twitter. My handle is @Murisa. Thank you again.